The crimson sun blazed across the Pacific horizon on June 3, 1942, casting long shadows over Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's flagship, the mighty battleship Yamato. The Imperial Japanese Navy had tasted nothing but victory for 6 months straight, and the confidence aboard every vessel in the combined fleet was palpable. From Pearl Harbor to the Philippines, from the Dutch East Indies to Wake Island, the rising sun had swept across the Pacific like an unstoppable tsunami of steel and fire. Yamamoto stood on the bridge, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, as he gazed toward the northeast horizon where Midway Atoll lay hidden. Beyond the curvature of the earth, the diminutive admiral, barely 5 feet 3 inches tall, commanded respect from every sailor in the Imperial Navy. His Harvard education and years serving in the United States had taught him to respect American industrial might, yet even he believed that one decisive blow could force the Americans to negotiate a favorable peace. The plan was audacious in its scope and complexity. Operation Me, as it was coded, would lure the remnants of the American Pacific Fleet into a trap where they could be annihilated once and for all. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the striking force of 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu. These floating airfields had been the spearhead of every Japanese victory since December 7, 1941, according to historical accounts documented in Walter Lord's comprehensive work Incredible Victory. Japanese intelligence suggested that Midway was lightly defended and ripe for the taking. The atoll would serve as an advanced base for future operations against Hawaii. But more importantly, its capture would force Admiral Chester Nimitz to commit his remaining carriers to battle, where they could be destroyed by Japan's superior numbers and experience. Captain Mitsuo Fukuda, the legendary pilot who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, prepared his air crews aboard the carrier Akagi. The deck crews worked tirelessly in the humid Pacific air, fueling and arming aircraft for what they believed would be another routine. Victory, Type 99 dive bombers and Type 97 torpedo bombers were spotted on deck, their engines warming in the pre-dawn darkness. Zero fighters, the feared Mitsubishi A-6M, stood ready to sweep American resistance from the skies. The Japanese force was overwhelming by any measure, from heavy carriers to battleships. 3 cruisers and 11 destroyers formed the core striking group. Additional forces included Admiral Nobutake Kondo's invasion force and Admiral Yamamoto's main body, with 3 more battleships, including the colossal Yamato with her 18-inch guns. Nearly 200 aircraft would participate in the initial assault, more than enough to reduce Midway's defenses to rubble. As dawn approached on June 4, 1942, the sea remained calm and the sky clear, perfect conditions for naval aviation. The Japanese pilots, veterans of countless battles, joked among themselves about another easy victory. Many had participated in every major operation since Pearl Harbor, and their confidence bordered on arrogance. They had never known defeat in this war, and the Americans had shown little fighting spirit in previous encounters. None aboard the Japanese vessels could imagine that in less than 24 hours, their mighty carrier force would lie broken beneath the Pacific waves, and with it, Japan's dreams of Pacific dominance would sink into the depths alongside their finest ships and most experienced air crews. The silence that would follow would echo across the empire, marking the beginning of the end for Japanese naval supremacy. 600 miles northeast of the approaching Japanese armada, the tiny coral atoll of Midway buzzed with desperate activity. Colonel Harold Shannon commanded the Marine garrison, while Commander Cyril Simard oversaw naval operations from the cramped command post. Every man on the island knew they were vastly outnumbered, but Admiral Chester Nimitz had given them a fighting chance through the miracle of code breaking. The breakthrough had come weeks earlier in the basement of Pearl Harbor, where Commander Joseph Rockford and his cryptanalysts of Station HYPO worked around the clock deciphering Japanese naval codes. The enemy's JN-25 code had been partially broken, revealing tantalizing glimpses of a major operation designated AF through clever deception. Rochefort's team confirmed that AF meant Midway, and they knew the Japanese were coming. In force. Armed with this intelligence, Nimitz made perhaps the most crucial decision of the Pacific War. He would commit his 3 remaining operational carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, to an ambush northeast of Midway. Task Force 16 under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance included Enterprise and Hornet, while Task Force 17 under Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher centered on Yorktown. Lieutenant Colonel James Roosevelt, son of the President, had recently visited Midway to assess its defenses, reporting back to Washington the island's precarious situation. The atoll's runway, carved from coral and sand, could barely accommodate the mixed collection of aircraft hastily assembled for its defense. Brewster Buffalo fighters, obsolete even by 1941 standards, would face the feared Japanese. Zeros, Douglas Dauntless dive bombers, and Grumman Avenger torpedo planes, flown by inexperienced crews, represented the island's offensive punch. As documented in Gordon Prange's definitive account Miracle at Midway, the American preparations were marked by improvisation and determination. Rather than overwhelming strength, Captain Mark Mitcher commanded the carrier Hornet, while Captain George Murray led Enterprise. The battle-scarred Yorktown, under Captain Elliot Buckmaster, had been repaired in an impossible 72 hours. At Pearl Harbor, after being severely damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea just 1 month earlier, the American plan relied entirely on surprise and precise timing. Fletcher and Spruance positioned their carriers northeast of Midway, beyond the range of Japanese reconnaissance aircraft. They would wait for Nagumo's force to launch its attack on the island, then strike while the Japanese flight decks were crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled. It was a desperate gamble that required perfect coordination and no small amount of luck. Admiral Nimitz himself remained at Pearl Harbor, monitoring radio traffic and trying to divine the enemy's exact intentions through fragmentary intelligence reports. The weight of the Pacific War rested on his shoulders. If the carriers were lost, the west coast of the United States would lie open to Japanese attack. There would be no second chance, no strategic reserve to fall back upon. Major General Willis Hale commanded Army Air Forces units in Hawaii, but most of his heavy bombers were committed to the Aleutian Campaign, another Japanese diversion. The few B-17 flying fortresses available for Midway's defense would have to attack from high altitude, an untested tactic against maneuvering ships at sea. As June 4th dawned clear and calm, the stage was set for the most decisive naval battle in Pacific history. The Americans, outnumbered and outgunned, possessed 2 crucial advantages. They knew the enemy was coming, and they had nothing left to lose. In the next 18 hours, the course of the war would be determined by the skill of pilots, the courage of sailors, and the random chance that governs all human conflict. At 0 for 30 hours on June 4, 1942, Admiral Nagumo launched the first wave of aircraft from his 4 carriers. 108 planes roared into the darkness toward Midway Atoll, 240 miles southeast of the Japanese striking force. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga led 36 Nakajima B-5 and Kate bombers, accompanied by 36 Aichi D-3 Avel dive bombers and 36 Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters. The thunder of aircraft engines echoed across the dark Pacific as the Japanese formation climbed toward their cruising altitude. These were the cream of Japanese naval aviation veterans who had honed their skills over China and perfected them at Pearl Harbor. Their target was a tiny speck of coral and sand that most had never heard of. Before receiving their briefing, meanwhile, Midway's primitive radar detected the incoming raid at 0520 hours. Air raid sirens wailed across the atoll as every available fighter scrambled to intercept. Major Floyd Parks led 26 Marine fighters into the dawn sky, a mixed collection of obsolete Brewster Buffaloes and a handful of more modern Grumman Wildcats. The Marines knew their aircraft were outclassed, but they climbed toward the enemy with grim determination. The aerial battle that followed was a slaughter. The Japanese Zeros, flown by pilots with years of combat experience, systematically destroyed the defending fighters. Major Parks himself was shot down and killed in the opening moments of combat. Within minutes, 17 of the 26 Marine fighters had been destroyed, with minimal damage inflicted on the Japanese formation. The Few surviving American pilots limped back to Midway with their aircraft shot full of holes and their confidence shattered. At 0620 hours, Lieutenant Tomonaga's bombers reached Midway and began their systematic destruction of the island's facilities. Hangars erupted in flames as bombs found their targets. The fuel storage depot exploded in a towering pillar of black smoke that could be seen for miles. The power plant was destroyed, leaving much of the island without electricity. Yet despite the devastation, Midway's runways remained operational, and its defensive guns continued firing. As detailed in Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully's exhaustive research in Shattered Sword, Tomonaga's damage assessment would prove crucial to the day's outcome. Flying over the smoking ruins of Midway's installations, the veteran pilot concluded that a second attack would be necessary to completely neutralize the base. He radioed back to Admiral Nagumo with the fateful message that would alter the course of history. Need second attack wave. Nagumo faced a critical decision aboard his flagship Akagi. His second wave of aircraft, 93 planes led by Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki, sat on the flight decks armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for attacks against ships. These weapons would be useless against land targets. Converting the strike to attack Midway would require at least an hour to rearm with high-explosive bombs suitable for land bombardment. The Japanese admiral was also troubled by the lack of contact with American naval forces. His reconnaissance aircraft had found nothing, yet intelligence suggested that some American ships might be in the area. Protocol demanded that he keep one strike wave armed for anti-ship attack until enemy surface forces were definitely located or ruled out. The decision would haunt him for the rest of his life. At 0715 hours, Nagumo made his choice. He ordered the second wave rearmed for a follow-up attack on Midway. Across his four carriers, ordnance crews began the laborious process of removing torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, replacing them with high-explosive bombs and incendiary devices. The hangar decks became scenes of frantic activity as tons of volatile ordnance were moved and stored. Unknown to Nagumo, his problems were just beginning. American search aircraft had finally located his force, and 3 desperate strikes were already airborne from Midway and the American carriers. Racing across the empty Pacific toward his unsuspecting fleet, the first American counterattack came from Midway itself, launched in desperation as Japanese bombs still fell on the smoking island. Major Lofton Henderson led 16 Douglas Dauntless dive bombers into the air at 0605 hours, followed by 15 Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses under Lieutenant Colonel Walter Sweeney. These were untested tactics against naval targets, but every available aircraft had to be committed to the battle. Henderson's Marines had trained for months on dive bombing techniques, but most had never attacked a moving ship at sea. As they approached the Japanese fleet at 0755 hours, the sight was both magnificent and terrifying, for massive carriers steamed in formation. Surrounded by a screen of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, anti-aircraft fire began to blossom around them like deadly flowers as the Japanese gunners opened fire. Major Henderson's aircraft was hit almost immediately, his engine streaming smoke and flame. Rather than turn away, the Marine officer pressed his attack, diving straight for the carrier. His aircraft was torn apart by anti-aircraft fire, but Henderson's sacrifice inspired his squadron. The Marines dove through the defensive fire with suicidal courage, but their obsolete aircraft and inexperience showed. No hits were scored on the Japanese carriers, and 8 of the 16 bombers were shot down. The high-altitude attack by Colonel Sweeney's B-17 bombers fared no better, bombing from 20,000 feet. The Army air crews could barely make out the individual ships below. Their bombs fell harmlessly into the ocean, creating towering waterspouts but inflicting no damage on the maneuvering Japanese fleet. The enemy's anti-aircraft fire couldn't reach the flying fortresses at such altitude, but the attack was completely ineffective, according to research compiled by Dallas Isom in the Battle of Midway. Why the Japanese lost. The failure of these initial attacks actually helped the Japanese by reinforcing their confidence and demonstrating the apparent weakness of American air power. Admiral Nagumo's staff dismissed the attacks as futile gestures from a defeated enemy. They could not imagine that far more dangerous threats were approaching from the northeast. At 0702 hours, Ensign Jack Reed flying a consolidated PBY Catalina flying boat had spotted the Japanese fleet and radioed its position to Admiral Fletcher aboard Yorktown. Enemy carriers bearing 30 degrees, distance 180 miles, course 150 degrees, speed 25 knots. This was the intelligence the American task force commanders had been waiting for since before dawn. Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard Enterprise made the crucial decision to launch immediately, even though his force was still beyond optimal attack range. Waiting longer would bring his aircraft closer to the target, but might allow the Japanese to escape or launch their own attack first. At 0706 hours, Enterprise began launching aircraft. The carrier Hornet followed suit minutes later. The American strike was hastily organized and poorly coordinated. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led 33 Douglas Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise, while Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay commanded 14 Devastator torpedo bombers. Commander Stanhope Ring launched 35 aircraft from Hornet, including 15 Devastators under Lieutenant Commander Jean Waldron's Torpedo Squadron 8. These American aircrews were largely untested in combat. Many had never dropped a torpedo or bomb in anger, and few had experience attacking naval targets. Their aircraft, while more modern than the Marines flying from Midway, were still inferior to their Japanese counterparts in many respects. The Devastator torpedo bomber was particularly obsolete, slow, and vulnerable to fighter attack. As the American formations winged across the empty Pacific toward their target, they carried with them the hopes of a nation. If they failed, the Japanese would complete their conquest of Midway and threaten Hawaii itself. The next 2 hours would determine whether American naval power in the Pacific could survive the war's first crucial test. At 0920 hours, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron's Torpedo Squadron 8 from the carrier Hornet found the Japanese fleet first. Waldron, a part Cherokee officer from South Dakota, had trained his men relentlessly in torpedo attack procedures. He possessed an almost supernatural ability to navigate over the trackless Pacific, leading his 15 Douglas Devastator torpedo bombers directly to their target despite radio silence and primitive navigation equipment. The sight that greeted Waldron's squadron was daunting, for Japanese carriers steamed in a rough diamond formation, protected by 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Combat Air Patrol Zeros circled above the fleet like deadly hawks, while anti-aircraft guns trained skyward in anticipation. The Japanese had been expecting more attacks since the morning's unsuccessful raids from Midway. Waldron's aircraft were hopelessly obsolete for their mission. The Devastator could manage only 200 miles per hour in level flight, making it easy prey for the nimble Japanese fighters. Worse, torpedo attacks required long, straight runs at low altitude, exposing the bombers to concentrated defensive fire for precious minutes. Every man in the squadron knew this was likely a suicide mission. Attack immediately. Waldron radioed to his pilots as Japanese Zeros dove from above. The 15 Devastators descended to wavetop height and began their torpedo runs against the carrier Soryu. Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki, who had been preparing to lead the second strike against Midway, watched in fascination as the American torpedo bombers pressed their attack despite overwhelming odds. The carnage was swift and complete. 0 fighters flown by Japan's most experienced pilots tore into the slow-moving American formation. Ensign George Gay watched his squadron mates die around him as his own aircraft was riddled with bullets. Machinist Harry Ferrier fired his rear gun until a cannon shell wounded him and jammed the weapon. One by one, the Devastators tumbled into the Pacific or exploded in mid-air. Within 10 minutes, 14 of the 15 torpedo bombers had been destroyed. Only Ensign Gay survived, floating in his life jacket among the wreckage and watching the battle unfold from sea level. Not a single torpedo had found its target. The Japanese pilots returned to their carriers confident that American naval aviation posed no serious threat to the combined fleet. Admiral Nagumo's staff celebrated this latest victory, but their elation was premature. The attack by Torpedo Squadron 8, though tactically unsuccessful, had drawn down the Japanese combat air patrol to sea level. The defending Zeros were now out of position and low on fuel and ammunition after their massacre of the torpedo bombers. More critically, the attack had disrupted the careful timing of Japanese flight operations. At 0918 hours, Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay's 14 Devastators from Enterprise appeared from the northeast, followed by 12 more from Yorktown under Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey. These torpedo squadrons met the same fate as their predecessors. Lindsay was shot down early in the attack, and Massey's aircraft was torn apart by anti-aircraft fire. Only 4 of the 26 torpedo bombers survived to return to their carriers. As chronicled in Mitsuo Fukuda's first-hand account Midway, the battle that doomed Japan, the Japanese pilots were amazed by the courage of the American torpedo bomber crews. "The Americans are brave," one Zero pilot remarked, "but their tactics are terrible." The sacrifice of 41 torpedo bombers and their crews seemed to confirm Japanese superiority in both equipment and training. Yet this apparent victory contained the seeds of disaster. The repeated low-level attacks had pulled the entire Japanese fighter screen down to wave height. The carrier's flight decks were crowded with aircraft being rearmed for the second strike on Midway, their hangar decks packed with volatile fuel and ordnance. At this crucial moment, with their defenses disrupted and their flight decks vulnerable, the Japanese fleet was about to face its greatest test. High above, undetected by the combat air patrol, American dive bombers were beginning their final approach to target. At 10:22 hours on June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's 33 Douglas Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise finally found the Japanese fleet after a frustrating search across empty ocean. McCluskey, a former fighter pilot turned bomber squadron leader, had made a crucial navigation decision that brought him to this moment. When he failed to find the enemy at the expected coordinates, he had turned north and followed the wake of a Japanese destroyer racing to rejoin the fleet. From 14,000 feet, the sight below was breathtaking. For magnificent carriers, steamed in formation, their flight decks packed with aircraft being prepared for launch, fuel hoses snaked across the wooden decks, and ordnance crews worked frantically to complete the rearming process that had been ongoing since Admiral Nagumo's fateful decision to prepare for a second strike on Midway. The carriers were more vulnerable than they had ever been during the entire war. The Japanese combat air patrol was completely out of position. Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki's Zeros had descended to sea level to intercept the American torpedo bombers and were now climbing desperately to regain altitude. Most were low on fuel and ammunition after their battles with the Devastators. The few fighters that remained at high altitude were outnumbered and caught completely by surprise. MCCLU Sky divided his force for maximum effect. Lieutenant Dick Best would lead 14 dive bombers against the carrier Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's flagship. McCluskey himself would attack Kaga with the remaining 19 aircraft. The attack was perfectly coordinated by accident rather than design, as the scattered American formations converged on the Japanese fleet at precisely the same moment from different directions. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's 17 Dauntless bombers from Yorktown arrived simultaneously from the south, adding to Japanese confusion and dividing their defensive fire. Leslie had lost his bomb during takeoff but continued to lead the attack, directing his pilots against the carrier Soryu. The timing was miraculous, the result of navigation errors and fuel shortages that had paradoxically brought 3 separate American squadrons to the same target at the same instant. At 10:24 hours, the American dive bombers pushed over into their attacks. The Douglas Dauntless, despite its limitations, was a superb dive bomber in the hands of a skilled pilot. These Navy aircrews had trained extensively in dive bombing techniques, and their accuracy would prove devastating. From their near-vertical dives, the American pilots could see individual Japanese sailors running across the carrier's flight decks. The first bomb hit Akagi at 10:26 hours. Lieutenant Dick Best's 1,000-pound weapon struck just behind the ship's island superstructure, penetrating the flight deck and exploding among aircraft being armed in the hangar below. Secondary explosions began immediately as aviation fuel and ordnance ignited in a growing inferno that would eventually consume the entire ship. Seconds later, Kaga received 3 direct hits from McCluskey's bombers. The first bomb struck near the island, the second hit amidships among parked aircraft, and the third penetrated to the hangar deck where it detonated among fueled and armed bombers. Within minutes, the carrier was a blazing wreck, her flight deck buckled and twisted by internal explosions. Soryu suffered an equally devastating attack. From Lieutenant Commander Leslie's Yorktown bombers, 3 bombs hit the carrier in rapid succession, one striking the flight deck forward, another amidships, and the third near the stern. Like her sister ships, Soryu began burning from stem to stern as aviation fuel fed the flames and ammunition exploded in sympathetic detonation. In less than 5 minutes, 3 of Admiral Nagumo's fleet carriers had been reduced to burning hulks. The cream of Japanese naval aviation, caught on deck during rearming operations, perished in the flames along with their irreplaceable aircraft. Experienced aircrews, who had participated in every major Japanese victory since Pearl Harbor, died in their cockpits or were consumed by the spreading fires, as documented in extensive post-war interviews conducted by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. The psychological shock to surviving Japanese personnel was devastating. The sight of their seemingly invincible carriers burning out of control shattered their confidence and marked the end of Japanese naval supremacy in the Pacific War.